Every neighborhood has one house that the collective conscience tries to erase, a blind spot in the manicured perfection that people pretend simply doesn't exist. In this specific community, that house belonged to Daniel Brooks. To understand the gravity of what happened, you first have to understand the ecosystem he lived in. This was a place where appearances didn't just matter, they were the only currency. The lawns were manicured to within a millimeter of their lives, the smiles were practiced in bathroom mirrors, and the silence was so heavy it felt curated. In a world of aggressive conformity, Daniel Brooks was a glitch. Hey everyone, if you're watching this, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Comment your city below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more shocking HOA stories. He was a man of clockwork habits, leaving before the sun breached the horizon and returning only after the streetlights had hummed to life. He offered no waves to neighbors washing their cars, engaged in no idle gossip over fences, and crucially, he never attended the mandatory social mixers. To the neighbors, his silence wasn't interpreted as shyness, it was read as suspicion. His house, however, was unimpeachable. It followed every bylaw in the handbook. The siding was power-washed, the hedges were geometric, and his trash bins vanished from the curb within minutes of collection. He gave them no noise, no complaints, and absolutely no ammunition. Yet, in communities like this, following the rules isn't enough. Being different is the only unforgivable crime. The tension broke on a Tuesday morning, shattered by a splash of aggressive color against the muted earth tones of the cul-de-sac. A bright orange warning notice had been slapped onto Daniel's front door. It was the first shot in a war the neighborhood didn't realize it was starting. The general of this opposing army was Linda Carter. As the HOA president, she didn't just manage the neighborhood, she ruled it like a fiefdom. Her power lay in her terrifyingly polite smile and her absolute control over the minutiae of other people's lives. When she decided Daniel's name belonged on the agenda, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. The charge was vague and bureaucratic, failure to participate in community engagement. It was the kind of rule made up on the fly to punish outsiders. Mark Reynolds, a man who treated his role as HOA enforcer with the gravity of a federal agent, was dispatched to deliver the message personally. He marched up the driveway, clipboard in hand, ready for a confrontation. He knocked heavily. Silence. He knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door opened, but only halfway. Daniel Brooks stood in the threshold. He didn't look sleepy or surprised. He stood with a stillness that was almost unnerving, his eyes scanning Mark with a detached, analytical calm. Mark adopted his coldest, most official tone, informing Daniel that the bylaws required homeowners to attend monthly meetings to foster community spirit. Daniel's reply was even, lacking any inflection of anger or fear. He simply stated that he followed every written rule in the covenant. Mark smirked, the expression of a man who knows the deck is stacked in his favor, and replied that the board decided what counted as a rule, not the homeowners. He slapped the final notice onto the wood of the doorframe. As Mark turned to walk away, expecting a shout or a slammed door, he felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. He glanced back. Daniel hadn't moved. He wasn't looking at the notice. He was looking at Mark. He didn't look scared. He looked alert. That night, the dynamic of the street shifted, witnessed only by the one person no one paid attention to. Mrs. Helen Wright was 73, and to most of the neighborhood, she was as invisible as a piece of porch furniture. But invisibility is a superpower. It allows you to see everything. Late that night, peering through her blinds, she saw Daniel's garage roll up. The light was stark. In the center of the concrete floor sat an old metal trunk, battered and secured with heavy-duty locks. Helen watched as Daniel knelt and lifted the lid. She couldn't see the entire contents, but she saw enough to make her breath hitch. There was a uniform folded with military precision. It wasn't casual clothing, and it certainly wasn't the attire of an office worker. By the next morning, the gossip network had done its work. The whispers traveled from jogging groups to dog walkers. Was he military, police, or something worse? Helen kept her mouth shut, but a nagging thought took root in her mind. If this man was dangerous, why was the HOA poking the bear? The answer to her internal question arrived in the form of a new targeted regulation. A notice went out regarding mandatory vehicle inspections, but it was a farce. Only Daniel's driveway had been marked with chalk. Inside the house, Emily Brooks, Daniel's wife, watched the neighbors gather across the street. She was visibly shaken, whispering that it felt personal, that they were being hunted in their own home. Daniel's reaction remained terrifyingly consistent. He told her calmly that bullies don't stop when you ignore them, they stop when they are stopped. That evening, Daniel did something he had never done. He walked to the community center. When he entered the meeting room, the chatter died instantly. The silence was thick, heavy with judgment. Linda Carter sat at the head table, flanked by her sycophants, smiling that tight, predatory smile. She welcomed everyone, claiming this meeting was about transparency and standards. Daniel remained standing. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the board members, and asked a single clear question. Is this meeting being recorded? Linda froze. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, dismissing the question. But Jason Miller, a younger board member, noticed something the others missed. Daniel wasn't acting like a victim. He wasn't defensive, and his hands weren't shaking. He looked like a man who had done his homework. The air in the room grew stifling, the fluorescent lights humming over the tension, and then the double doors at the back of the room swung open. A uniformed police officer stepped inside. The whispers erupted immediately. Emily's face went pale, fearing the worst, thinking perhaps Mark had filed a false report. The officer scanned the room, ignoring the board entirely, and locked eyes with Daniel. He asked for Daniel Brooks. Linda's smile returned, triumphant and cruel. This was it, the humiliation she had orchestrated. Daniel stood up slowly, straightening his jacket. He told the officer that he would speak with him after the meeting concluded. But the officer didn't grab him. He didn't pull out handcuffs. He nodded, a sharp, deferential gesture of respect, and stepped aside to wait by the wall. The atmosphere in the room curdled. Police officers do not treat criminals with deference. They do not wait politely for suspects to finish their HOA disputes. Linda, blind to the shift in power, made the biggest mistake of her life. She slammed her gavel and raised her voice, declaring that the HOA would proceed with enforcement measures regardless of Daniel's cooperation. Daniel's voice cut through the room, louder this time, resonating off the walls. He informed her that if she proceeded, she would be acting outside the law. Mrs. Helen Wright, trembling slightly, stood up from the back row and told the board to leave the man alone. Linda sneered, intoxicated by her perceived authority, claiming this was a community decision. Daniel looked directly at her, his eyes cold and hard. He told her that if that was the case, then what happened next was entirely on the HOA. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. By sunrise the next morning, the neighborhood realized that the equilibrium had been shattered. The street was lined with HOA-contracted trucks. Men with clipboards, cameras, and laser measures swarmed the property line. Linda stood on the curb, arms crossed, overseeing the operation like a general on a battlefield. She announced loudly, for the benefit of the twitching curtains in every window, that this was an official compliance inspection. Daniel stepped onto his porch. He didn't yell, he didn't run, he watched. When Mark Reynolds began photographing the interior of Daniel's car through the driver's side window, Daniel spoke once. He told him he didn't have permission. Mark laughed, high on the thrill of authorized vandalism, and retorted that the HOA didn't need permission. Daniel slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He gave them one final warning. Linda rolled her eyes and ordered Mark to continue. Daniel tapped a single name on his speed dial and held the phone to his ear. He spoke 3 words, then hung up. The tone of the day shifted instantly. Within minutes, the sound of an engine cut through the silence, distinct from the idling HOA trucks. A black SUV turned onto the street. It bore no HOA logo, no magnetic decals, and no markings of any kind. It moved with a heavy, deliberate purpose, parking quietly behind the cluster of compliance vehicles. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was older, dressed in a suit that cost more than Mark's car, and he carried himself with an authority that made the clipboard-wielding enforcers instinctively lower their cameras. This was Captain Robert Hayes. Linda stiffened, sensing a challenger to her territory. She marched over, her voice sharp and brittle, snapping that this was a private community and he had no business interrupting an official inspection. Hayes didn't even look at her. He didn't acknowledge her existence. He walked in a straight line toward Daniel, his eyes locked on the homeowner. When he reached him, the interaction wasn't one of arrest or interrogation. Hayes extended a hand. Daniel took it. They shook, not with the casual warmth of friends, but with the rigid professional respect of colleagues. The neighbors watching from their windows felt the confusion ripple through the street. Mark stepped back, lowering his camera completely. Linda, unable to process being ignored, forced herself between them. She demanded to know if there was a problem. Hayes finally turned his head. He looked at her with the dispassionate gaze one might give a minor traffic obstruction and simply said, "Yes, there is." He turned back to Daniel and spoke loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, addressing him not as Mr. Brooks, the problematic homeowner, but as Daniel Brooks, former federal investigator. A wave of shock moved through the observers like a physical force. The silence that followed was total. Linda laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that grated on the air, dismissing the title as irrelevant to HOA bylaws. Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He began to list offenses with the cadence of a judge reading a verdict: harassment, selective enforcement, trespassing. He explained with terrifying clarity that these were not policy violations. They were criminal matters. Jason Miller, standing by the curb, felt his stomach drop. Helen Wright watched from her porch, and suddenly the pieces fit. The rigid schedule, the alertness, the silence. It wasn't suspicion. It was discipline. Daniel finally spoke to Linda. His voice was quiet, devoid of triumph. He reminded her that he had asked them to stop. Linda's face hardened into a mask of denial, accusing him of threatening the HOA. Daniel shook his head. He told her he wasn't threatening her, he was documenting her. That was the moment the neighborhood realized this had never been a fight. It had been a sting operation. Hayes gestured to the HOA crew, ordering cameras off and demanding they step back. No one argued. The authority in his voice was absolute. Linda's voice cracked as she accused them of intimidation. Daniel replied evenly that it wasn't intimidation, it was accountability. He turned and pressed the keypad on his garage door. The motor hummed and the door rose slowly. Inside, there were no weapons, no stolen goods, nothing that the gossip mill had churned out. There was only order. The metal trunk was open now, revealing rows of color-coded files, folders, and hard drives. Daniel had been collecting everything, every notice, every unreasonable demand, every instance of Mark peering over the fence had been logged, dated, and backed up. Helen's eyes widened. He hadn't been hiding out of fear. He had been preparing a case. Emily stepped beside her husband, her face no longer pale, looking at Linda with a mixture of pity and resolve. She whispered that they had been warned. Hayes turned to face the neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk. He addressed the community with a voice that carried to the back rows. He acknowledged that HOAs have authority, but he reminded them that they do not possess immunity. He announced that the association was now under formal investigation. Linda tried to interrupt, to spin the narrative, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Mark looked at her, panic rising in his eyes, realizing the shield of just following orders had just evaporated. Jason Miller whispered that they had gone too far. Linda snapped at him, claiming everyone was overreacting, but her hands were shaking. Daniel stepped forward, leaving the sanctuary of his garage. He looked at the board members who had made his life a misery for months. He told them they had ignored his words, ignored the warnings, and ignored the law. He paused, looking around at the silent houses. But he noted they hadn't ignored power, and now real power was standing on their lawn. By that night, the illusion of control had dissolved. Resignation emails began circulating before the sun had fully set. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had undergone a radical transformation. The fines were quietly withdrawn. The absurd rules about bin placement and lawn height were suspended. Linda stopped answering her door. Mark quit his post as enforcer, disappearing from the neighborhood entirely. Jason resigned publicly, trying to salvage his reputation. One by one, the neighbors approached Daniel. The interactions were awkward, stilted apologies, sheepish waves, eyes that couldn't quite meet his. Daniel listened to them all. He didn't gloat, he didn't celebrate. He accepted the contrition with the same stoicism he had accepted the abuse. Helen stopped him one evening as he checked his mail. She told him he could have destroyed them, could have sued them into bankruptcy. Daniel nodded, acknowledging the possibility. He told her he didn't want revenge. When she asked what he wanted, he looked up at the quiet street where the tension had finally broken and simply said, "Peace." But the story wasn't over for everyone. For Linda Carter, the nightmare was just beginning. The moment the formal investigation commenced, she stopped sleeping. The HOA office lights remained dark, but inside her home, the glow of screens burned through the night. She was frantically trying to organize a defense, convincing herself that this was a temporary misunderstanding. Then the official envelope arrived. It wasn't a warning notice, it was a subpoena. Rumors spread faster than the truth ever could. The community whispered about selective enforcement, fake violations, and threats. Linda was no longer the predator, she was the prey, and she was losing the one thing that had protected her, her anonymity within the system. Investigators met with Daniel privately, not to interrogate him, but to collect evidence. He handed over the files from the garage. Audio recordings of meetings, time-stamped photos of Mark trespassing, emails that proved intent. The lead investigator was stunned by the volume of it. Daniel merely explained that he assumed this outcome was inevitable. As the investigators dug deeper, the pattern emerged. Daniel wasn't the first victim, he was just the first one who knew how to fight back. Previous homeowners had sold their houses at a loss just to escape the harassment. Linda's signature was on every escalation. Jason Miller was called in for questioning and, realizing the ship was sinking, cooperated fully. He admitted he thought the aggressive enforcement was normal, that he had been swept up in Linda's vision of a perfect kingdom. Linda's lawyer made one final desperate play, demanding a private meeting with Daniel to settle the matter quietly. Daniel refused. There was no anger in his refusal, only a sense of finality. The time for talking had passed months ago. That evening, the vote was cast. Linda was formally removed as HOA president. She didn't attend the meeting. Her chair sat empty, a symbol of her absolute defeat. A town hall was called, organized not by the board, but by the residents. The atmosphere was different, chaotic, raw, but honest. Neighbors stood up and admitted they had been scared, that they had looked away because they didn't want to be the next target. Helen addressed the room, her voice frail but steady. She told them that they had let this happen because they valued silence over justice. When the room turned to look at Daniel, standing quietly at the back, he offered no condemnation. He understood the psychology of compliance better than anyone. The final charges were announced publicly: fraud, harassment, abuse of authority. The HOA was dissolved, replaced by a third-party management company bound by strict transparency laws.
Weeks later, Daniel received a letter stating the case was closed. He folded it neatly, sitting on his porch in the twilight. There were no notices on his door, no trucks idled at the curb. The neighborhood didn't ignore him anymore. They respected him. They had learned a hard lesson. The most dangerous neighbor isn't the one who breaks the rules, but the one who stays calm while everyone else breaks the law.
For the first time in months, the morning routine on Daniel's street was aggressively normal. No one knocked on his door. The sidewalk was empty of clipboard-wielding enforcers. Mornings were quieter, the air lighter. Daniel walked the perimeter of his property without the sensation of eyes burning into his back. Emily slept through the night for the first time since the first notice appeared. The fear didn't vanish instantly, trauma as a half-life, but it was loosening its grip. Neighbors waved now. Some were genuine, others looked away in shame, unable to reconcile their complicity with his vindication. Daniel didn't chase their apologies. He accepted the peace for what it was. Then, one final message arrived. It was a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten. It wasn't an apology, it was a justification. Linda wrote about the pressure she felt, the stress of maintaining property values, the weight of community expectations. She framed herself as a martyr to standards. Daniel read it once, his face impassive. He folded it carefully, not to respond, but to file it away. It served as a reminder of a crucial truth he had learned years ago. Power doesn't corrupt people instantly, it reveals who they already were. Linda, however, wasn't done facing the consequences of that revelation. The local news picked up the story. Headlines rippled through the county. Former HOA president charged with abuse of authority. The article was scathing. Linda's name became toxic. Job interviews ended abruptly when background checks were run. Her social circles evaporated. The people who had once sought her favor now treated her with the same icy exclusion she had weaponized against others. Justice didn't shout at her in the street. It simply followed her, dismantling her life piece by piece. Meanwhile, the neighborhood faced a choice. A new community meeting was held. The vibe was unrecognizable from the tense, stifled gatherings of the past. There were no threats, no impending fines. The discussion was open. Rules were read aloud and debated. Votes were counted in front of everyone. Daniel spoke only once. He stood and said that authority exists to protect people, not to control them. There was no applause, just a murmur of understanding. They were finally listening. In the aftermath, the new board offered Daniel a position. The support was unanimous. They wanted his competence, his clarity. He declined. He told them he didn't want power, he wanted boundaries. It was an answer that stayed with them. Most people confused the two, seeking control when they should have sought fairness. Daniel returned to his quiet life, the same one he had fought so hard to protect. One evening, Mrs. Helen Wright visited him. She stood on his porch, looking smaller than ever, but her eyes were bright. She told him she knew he was different from the start. Daniel smiled faintly, a rare expression, and told her that she was the only one who hadn't ignored him. She nodded, understanding the weight of that simple act. As she walked away, Daniel looked around. Kids were playing in the driveways again. Porch lights flickered on as dusk settled. The neighborhood felt human, flawed, messy, but honest. Daniel stood on his porch, watching the street settle into the night. He hadn't changed. The neighborhood had. They didn't fear him anymore. They didn't pretend he didn't exist. They respected him. Not because of his past title or the files in his garage, but because of how he had stood in the fire without burning. Sometimes the strongest neighbor isn't the one with the loudest voice or the most authority. It's the one who never raises his voice until it matters.